Yeah, it's just to be brutally honest, and you have to accept that for what it is.
Oh, also, when I bring Jim and Roland in, I'll just let you both introduce yourself, just so it's easier.
That's fine.
Okay. We will begin in around 2 minutes. Hello, everyone. Hi, everybody, welcome in. Everyone's rolling in. If you want in the chat, you can let me know where you're coming from. I think it'd be great to know where our viewers are all coming from. So just let us know in the chat. Usually I'd have music playing at this point, but maybe not now. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Wow, California, thank you so much for coming. Colorado, nice. Hello, Virginia. Hello, OCA. How is it going? 1 more minute. Hello, Tampa. Hi, Roland. Roland's also here. Give it just a little bit more. We'll start exactly at 6 Eastern. All right, I guess we can get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Lady Marie Balilan. I am the Chapter and Membership Development Associate for OCA National. I am so grateful that all of you are here to be talking with us in our first of 4 history webinars that we will be having throughout the year. I'm very excited for this. And so I'm just so happy that all of you can make it tonight. We have a lot to discuss and a lot to unpack and learn and just talk about, especially in this very significant case of the life of Vincent Chin and the effects that is brought to us even almost 40 years later to today, obviously. And these are things that are very important to talk about. So I'm just so grateful that you're all here and you all decided to be here on your Friday night. So to kind of break down how we'll be doing this, I will go over basically the timeline of what happened, and then we'll have a moment to speak with our panelists to kind of go over the significant points, and then we'll have a quick resources, and then we'll go into a Q&A session. So we can go ahead and get started. So we can go ahead to the next slide. So the early life of Vincent Chin, May 18, 1955. Vincent Chin, he was born in Guangdong Province, China. In 1961, Vincent's parents, David and Lily Chin, were unable to have their own children. And so that prompted them to adopt Vincent from a Chinese orphanage in 1961. So he came into Michigan when he was around 6 years old. In 1971, 10 years later, Vincent grew up and in Highland Park, Michigan, after his father was mugged in 1971. And so the family moved to Oak Park, Michigan. Next slide. In 1973, Vincent graduated from Oak Park High in 1973, and he was going to study at the Control Data Institute. In 1982, Vincent was working as an industrial draftsman at Efficient Engineering, an automotive supplier, and he worked weekends as a server at the Golden Star restaurant in Ferndale, Michigan. In 1982 also, Vincent was engaged to be married to Victoria Huang with the wedding date set for June 28, 1982. So we're going to set the scene a little bit. So this was the 1980s of Detroit, Michigan. The American automotive industry was rivaling against Japan's successful one. And so because of a massive oil crisis, smaller and more gas efficient cars were more desirable to buy from Japanese companies rather than American companies, hurting the Motor City, Motor City, Detroit, hurting their big three, which was Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors. So a lot of people were losing jobs because of it. And so this created an anti-Asian sentiment, and especially, towards the Japanese community. Go ahead. So we bring ourselves to 27-year-old Vincent Chin. He was going to get married in 1 week. And so to celebrate his last moments of bachelor life, he went with his friends to the Fancy Pants bar in Highland Park, Michigan. So you can just kind of picture the scene and everything. And then enter 43-year-old Ronald Evans and his 22-year-old stepson, Michael Nitz, into the club. And Nitz was just laid off from his automotive job at Chrysler. Racing Caldwell, a dancer, overheard Evans say, "It's because of you mother effers that we're out of work," assuming Chin was Japanese when he's actually Chinese American. Chin heard this and the altercation with Evans began. Then the club immediately threw out the two and the rest of their group, and they continued their exchanges outside. Chin and his friend Jimmy Choi were able to get away until Nitz and Evans drove for 30 minutes to try to find them. Enough time for common sense to set in, obviously, which it does not. The two also paid $20 to Jimmy Perry to help them find Chin. Nitz and Evans found Chin at a McDonald's after 30 minutes of driving, and Nitz held down Chin as Evans beat him with a baseball bat. Two off-duty officers were late in intervening, drew their guns, but the beating had already been done. 4 days later, on June 23rd, 1982, Vincent Chin died after being disconnected from life support. On June 29, 1982, Vincent Chin was buried the day after what would have been his wedding day, with his 400 guests at his funeral instead. Evans and Nitz were originally charged with second-degree murder, which was seen as unplanned but intentional killing, but later pled guilty and no contest, and the charge was brought down to manslaughter. Sentencing was done by the Wayne County Circuit Judge Charles Kaufman without prosecuting attorneys or Chin's family present, and only heard from defense attorneys. Evans and Nitz were sentenced to only 3 years probation and a $3,000 fine. Judge Kaufman stated, "You don't make the punishment fit the crime, you make the punishment fit the criminal." And he also said, had it been a brutal murder, Judge Charles Kaufman adds, "Of course, these guys would be in jail." Next slide. So this sentencing, this very featherly sentencing, angered the Asian American community and brought it to organize. And this was something that has not really been seen before. This brought the American Citizens for Justice, also known as ACJ. So Roland Huang worked with Qin Yi, head of the Chinese Benevolent Association and honorary mayor of Chinatown, and the American Citizens for Justice was born. Others involved include author Helen Zia, Marissa Truong Ming, other journalists, automotive engineers, volunteer lawyers, and more. So ACJ held a rally at Kennedy Square, and attorney Lisa Chan filed a motion to reopen the sentencing, claiming that the parties were misrepresented, and these appeals were not successful. So it seemed that the only plausible way for justice to be had was to bring this to the federal level. So Lily Chin met with Attorney General for Civil Rights, William Bradford Reynolds. The FBI agreed to investigate, and Vincent Chin's case was now under a federal criminal trial. This resulted in a guilty verdict against Ronald Evans and Michael Nitz and a 20-year sentence. But the case was brought to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals and overturned the verdict, saying there were trial errors. So with that motion, a venue change was granted, and the case was brought to Cincinnati, Ohio, where a jury found Ronald Evans not guilty of a civil rights violation in killing Vincent Chin, thus never spending a day in jail. Under the terms of the wrongful death matter, Michael Nitz's insurance policy limit of $50,000 was paid. Evans in the past has blamed alcohol and temper rather than racism. Evans has also said in an interview in June 2012, the 30-year anniversary of Vincent's death, that quote, killing Chin was the only wrong thing I ever done in my life. At the same time, next slide. Evans was also charged and agreed to pay $2 million, but after a token 1 or 2 payments, Evans left to Nevada and did not continue paying. And so with interest, that amount ballooned to more than $8 million. Evans is now essentially judgment proof because his asset total falls below Nevada's homestead exemption, which is $500,000. That prevents seizure of all of his assets. And so the ACJ attached a lien on a 2000 RV and a 2000 Subaru. And the judge decided that Evans had to have a means of transportation, and the Subaru was the wife. So he was able to essentially keep all of it, and did not pay off what he was supposed to. Evans sued his job back at Chrysler, and Chrysler won the case based on Evans' guilty plea to manslaughter. Lily Chin, Vincent Chin's mother, she established a scholarship with ACJ in Vincent's memory. She was very active in speaking up for Vincent, even though it hurt her deeply to relive these moments. And so because of it, she eventually moved back to Guangzhou, China, to leave the traumatic reminders that she kept getting from a country that she originally fled to for comfort and opportunity, which is something that I feel a lot of us Asian Americans in our communities can relate to today. She did end up returning to the US for medical treatment in late 2001, and she died June 2, 2002. So that is basically the timeline of events that transpired in that time. Obviously, this was a complicated time, but there were many events that transpired and made the federal government and the US government look at the Asian American community in a different light, in a way that they realized that we were not being protected and we were not being recognized. I'm gonna bring in two speakers with me. I'd like to introduce Jim Shimura and Roland Huang, who were both there in Detroit as it was happening. So Jim, you can go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Jim Shimura, a native Detroiter. I've been a lawyer now for, actually this will be 42 years this year. And I was one of the original volunteer attorneys who met with Mrs. Chin back in 1983 when the case started. I've been an activist for a long time in the community. I've done everything from student organizing all the way through to things like the Democratic Party and a lot of things in between. It's been almost like a lifelong, I guess, journey working on the case. And even to this very day, I don't think a day goes by I don't think about it and how it's impacted me personally. Mm-hmm. And especially in the current environment, you worry about how it affects everyone in the community at large. It's been a privilege to work on it, but also very frustrating. We can talk about it a little bit later on as far as the frustration factor.
Right. Thank you, Jim. Roland, you can go ahead and introduce yourself.
Oh, sure. Roland Huang, and I'm the current president of American Citizens for Justice, as well as a founding member of American Citizens for Justice. I am currently the Vice President Public Affairs for OCA. At the time, in 1983, a year after the killing of Vincent Chin, at the time, OCA and OCA Detroit got involved. I was the Detroit chapter president at the time. And my involvement in the case began with Kinyi calling me, he calling on behalf of the Benevolent Association, calling me as the OCA Detroit president, and just asking for assistance, getting a group together to just figure out what to do after the probation and fine sentence rendered by Judge Kaufman. And so it really was the beginning of a lot of effort in terms of having a rally for justice for Vincent Chin, having a debate as to whether or not Vincent was entitled to protection of the civil rights laws, being an immigrant, being an Asian American, beyond the black-white paradigm. So that was the beginning of my involvement really in civil rights.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, the both of you obviously have been so involved in this activist work, especially for the AAPI community and for advocacy. I just think it's so important, to have that perspective of what it was like then, especially in how it applies now. So one point that I wanted to bring up was the Black and Asian solidarity that happened for the Vincent Chin case, which I feel like not a lot of people know about. So after the sentence of probation, ACJ and the APA community could not get a meeting with the then prosecutor, William Callahan. And so it took the intervention of New Detroit, the urban coalition that arose from the 1967 Detroit riot, and the Detroit Organization of Black Organizations for a meeting to occur with the prosecutor. What was that like in that moment of coalition, of coming together as two communities of color?
Well, we certainly realized that we were too weak without any organized civil rights organization to lobby for us, to gain the ear of the people that mattered. And so that's because, we were weak, not organized. And so that led to this coalition building that included DABO, the NAACP Detroit chapter, New Detroit, ADL, Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, and a lot of other organizations. And those contacts continue to this day.
Wow.
We really owe a great debt of gratitude to the late Horace Sheffield Jr. He was really the one who kind of broke the door down to get the meeting with Cahalan, the prosecutor at the time. I think one thing we learned very early in the game is that the fact that unless you have political access, you can't really get leverage, you can't get the attention of people. And
right.
The process which ultimately led to the federal prosecution under civil rights laws was a collective effort, not just of the local group, but also bringing this national network and bringing in other civil rights organizations across the board. Things like Japanese American Citizens League. We had groups like the Asian Law Caucus. These are all people that came on board in different forms to try to build pressure to bear. The Asian Pacific Legal Center, Southern California. These are all people that they basically provided, the networking and resources for the effort to try to get the Department of Justice to take on the civil rights prosecution.
It's worth noting that OCA's director, Laura Chin, at the time, was active in getting William Bradford Reynolds, the civil rights assistant attorney general for civil rights, to agree to meet with Helen Zia and Lily Chin and our delegation. So OCA National really played a part in getting a federal involvement at that time.
Yeah, I think it's a great point to just, this is not a time to be going against each other. It's so important to come together from different backgrounds and communities in order to really get moving and to get that attention we need from the government, from, the media and things like that. I also want to talk about ACJ coming in for actual investigation, because the police and the law enforcement did not do enough per se on their own. So ACJ and journalists are the ones that actually went to the Fancy Pants bar themselves and interviewed the dancers and got that quote from Racine Caldwell saying that she heard the assailants using racist slurs. And, you know, the quote that everyone uses to give that proof of a hate crime is because of you mother effers that were out of work. And it's so interesting that, you know, it's not accredited to the community that actually got that quote, and people just generally assume that it was law enforcement. What was that like for ACJ to do their own investigation in this case?
Can I mention that we, the community, we trusted the system. We thought that justice would work.
Mm-hmm.
ACJ got founded a year after the killing. It's after the probation and fine sentence. And so we trusted the system, and really law enforcement only took the easy way out in terms of looking at the beating on Woodward Avenue,
Mm-hmm.
and didn't bother to figure out what led to the altercation on Woodward Avenue. And they didn't know what was said. And that is really so important for defining a civil rights case.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something that should be repeated in the situation we have now. Like
Right.
with Atlanta, there have to be some witnesses to find out if things were said instead of just saying it's a shooting.
Right.
So it's so important to lay the foundation.
One thing about the investigation, which preceded the meeting with William Bradford Reynolds, Lisa Chan, who unfortunately died last year, was the lawyer that took on the responsibility to try to gather a lot of the information to pass along to the Department of Justice. But again, having very limited resources and having to try to do this on a purely volunteer basis is really tough. Eventually, we were able to raise money as a community and to be able to support the effort.
Wow.
But the amount of holes in the story and the lack of I call aggressive prosecution and investigation by the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office is very, very apparent from day one. And in fact, I think it was, I'm not sure it was either Morris Cotton or Mike Gardenhire. I think both of them said the case was very badly handled. They handed the report over to the prosecutor. They said this guy should have got murder one. They say they were shocked he was only allowed to plead to murder two, and then reduced to manslaughter. They thought he was just undercharged from the very beginning.
Wow.
And the fact that the prosecutor did not show up at the sentencing speaks volumes of how little they thought of the case.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, imagine if somebody was charged and in today's environment and nobody showed up. I mean, you'd have, people picketing around the clock around the courthouse. But at the time, this is sort of like really crass and like I say, in many ways, racist kind of tone deafness to what the case really signified.
Right.
And, this is how it turned out. And to this very day, I talk to lawyers and they say they're still appalled by the fact that the prosecutor didn't show up, especially on a homicide. It's one thing if you're shoplifting. Okay, I can understand that. When somebody dies, they have an obligation to show up in court, and they didn't do that. And
Wow.
we had a long running battle with Cahalan and a lot of, in fact, we're still fighting with the son who's running around here. That's another story in itself. He's another former judge who is still trying to do a revisionist history. But it's something which I think you can take some guidance going forward in these other cases that are happening around the country. You've got to be on alert, and you've got to put pressure on the DA and prosecutors and let the courts say we're not going to stand by and let this thing get swept into the rug. It has to be dealt with forthrightly, and the punishment has to meet the crime.
Yes.
You should have a court watch ready to go just in case something turns into litigation. And it's important, this case is important for the procedural changes, because at the time, the prosecutor's office merely got the plea. And if it was guilty, a guilty plea, they didn't bother to go to sentencing. They trusted the judge to have his or her own judgment about what the sentence should be. There wasn't an advocate for the prosecution, and the prosecution was not there. It wasn't until the subsequent prosecutor, John O'Hare, got into office that we met with the subsequent prosecutor, and he instituted the procedure that assistant prosecutors will be at sentencing from then on.
Right.
That didn't help Vincent. So
yeah. Yeah, and it's when you bring up the fact that this case did so much to the process of sentencing, it made such a huge difference. And so, you know, with this case, not only did it bring attention to the lack of protection for the AAPI community, but it also showed, you know, the holes that were happening in this process. And so the fact that there was not a prosecuting attorney present, and the fact that Chin's family was not present to give a statement, and the venue change from Detroit to Cincinnati, just to show that the significance of all of these factors were, because of this case, were considered in future ones. And so, you know, how, as Asian American lawyers today, you know, how do you feel about the changes that have been born from this case originally 40 years ago?
I can say that there were some changes immediately after the case. Jim Shimura and I were appointed hearing referees for the Department of Civil Rights. At the time, there hadn't been any Asian American judges in Michigan. And then since then, there have been a couple. And so there is change. There hadn't been any legislators who were Asian American. Now we've had maybe 5. So, you know, there is a change to the landscape since the case.
Yeah, but I think political empowerment has a lot to do with how the outcome might have been different 40 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that has changed, though, too, is the fact that there was a awareness, at least within the APA community nationally. I think the case obviously brought focus and helped build a coalition that survives this very day and continues.
Right.
I think 2 groups in particular, outside of the American Citizens for Justice, really were born by the case. I know, talking to people who are part of the founders of the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association, and also people involved with the Asian American Journalists Association, both groups to a person have said the case really kind of triggered this sort of national awareness. And I know in the case of NAPABA would not exist now, but for the fact that the people that helped found that were heavily involved with the coalition building around the case itself. So there's a silver lining to what went on back then. The 2 organizations that emerged over the last 35 years or so came directly from the activity around the case. So we do feel, I guess, in that way, it's I guess makes us feel good, the fact that we did help be sort of the catalyst
Mm-hmm.
activity.
Yeah. So in terms of, you know, the community, you know, the community was very involved in this case, and in terms of it moving forward to the federal level. What was that like to know that you were, you know, the community was coming together and supporting each other in different aspects, right? So how was that for you in like a first time basis for an Asian American focused case?
Can I mention the importance of media and journalists?
Yes.
Because Helen Zia was our first secretary, and she handled the public relations. And that chance meeting with Judith Cummings of the New York Times, which led to an article in the New York Times, and then later the Tribune in Chicago and Asahi News and everywhere else. The focus of the media on the case drove the case. It made any inattention by the FBI or the authorities or DOJ, it would be problematic. And so really the importance of getting the media to show interest in the case is key. It is now, especially, you know, during this pandemic and after Atlanta, but it certainly was the case with the Vincent Chin case back in '83.
You know, at the time, and we were told this by the Department of Justice, to date, you realize this is before the internet even existed. No cell phones. I mean, it's tough to get out. But he said at the time they received over 15,000 letters and phone calls saying people wanted the Department of Justice to take on the civil rights prosecutions. That was remarkable, you know, all things considered, like that. And also the fact that, you know, media drives, I mean, everything, and especially at a time when you didn't have, you know, massive cable TV and stuff, you had to fight everywhere you could to try to get public attention. And it meant whenever you would go out and travel locally and out of town, there's press, you have to really kind of get the attention to try to build a sort of sort of mass, education of what the case stood for. So it's a lot of work. And in today's world, it's a lot easier because the media and access are much more accessible because of social media and the fact that you have basically a very short news cycle, which I guess is both good and the bad in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, with Atlanta, you have to have this constant drumbeat in the background to let the public know and let the authorities know that we're watching you. We're not going to stand by idly.
Right.
And unfortunately, there's been like an incident about every 5 minutes recently of people being attacked.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the difficulty I think right now is to try to get above the noise. I mean, unfortunately, because of the short news cycle, page one today, and next thing you know, you're off of page one, you're back in the back section. It's hard to get that sort of consistent message. That's why, organizations have got to be on top of this. Their membership and people who are in positions who can advocate have got to be out there, out
Yeah.
front, trying to make the story in the public light constantly.
Yes.
This is a moment for attention, really, because for the Atlanta cases, FBI Director Chris Wray says he found no evidence thus far of a hate crime. I find that appalling. And the whole notion that race was not in play and dismissive by the Cherokee County Sheriff is problematic. And I think that really the focus right now should be, the attention should be placed on that case through the media and through activism, because really this is potentially a replay of all the travesty that occurred in the Vincent Chin case, just potentially repeating itself now in Atlanta.
Well, I mean, the facts in the Atlanta killing is pretty obvious. You've got a white male who shot Asians. I mean, that by definition is a hate crime right there. And especially when this guy had an obsession with going to massage parlors and objectivization of Asian women. I mean, that goes to the very root of this whole racist backdrop. I mean, this goes back to the last 2 centuries as far as the way Asians are viewed, particularly Asian women. You talk about the sort of Susie Huang kind of exotic view and dehumanization of women are all part of that I think the backdrop there. And the way this has been depicted, at least by Chris Wray and by the local prosecutor, really is insulting in a lot of ways, because the facts and the backdrop clearly go against anything other than being a racially motivated killing.
Mm-hmm.
In mistake.
Part of our mission, I think, is to get law enforcement to have a mindset consistent with the victims community, instead of being dismissive about a potential hate crime because the person said, well, I'm not a racist or whatever, is just the easy way out. Law enforcement has to take the mindset of the victims community. What is the effect on the AAPI community because of all this violence, and not necessarily just dismiss it because they adopt the mindset of the perpetrator.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a great point, Roland. Yeah, and I think it's so obvious how just so much of what happened 40 years ago and the effects are still very strong and living today. And so, and we talked about, media, and we talked about, Helen Zia and being able to wear these different hats in terms of activism, that we all have our own, techniques and attributes and skills that we can offer. How do you think that this would all, apply? I mean, obviously we've been talking about Atlanta. How would it apply into our efforts today, do you think?
I think we have the raw organizational structure through chapters, like OCA is a chapter-driven organization. You have a built-in group of eyes and ears that can be witnesses, that can be support, that can be a court watch, that sort of thing, that can provide comfort for victims' families. And that is really, it's an opportunity for the chapters to grow in terms of advocacy and support, not merely just being mere members. And I think that should be replicated throughout, the chapters.
Mm-hmm.
One thing you can do locally, and it's very multidimensional and many layers to it, but you have to be engaged with politicians, law enforcement, particularly with the DA or prosecutor in your local area, but also the media. A lot of the reporters tend to be very tone deaf about this. And in fact, we're going through this right now with the local PBS station here in Detroit, trying to get them to have a much better, feel and empathy and understand why the way we are portrayed, in TV programs and news, et cetera, has an impact day to day.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Very important, and that's something that has to go on constantly. That's something you can't do. I mean, each locale has its own unique set of players and in the media market to address, and it has to be done that way. But also too, getting back to law enforcement, there are a lot of closet racists. Let's face it, in law enforcement, and, and one thing that has to come out of this is you've got to get the whether it's state police or county sheriffs or local law enforcement to root out people that clearly do not have the best interests of the community at large
Mm-hmm.
while on the job. I mean, if you look at the riot on January 6th, there were a lot of law enforcement people in that crowd, off duty, and they should have been fired immediately. I mean, the fact is that you cannot have people have that kind of racial and ethnic prejudice enforcing the laws, which has to be done obviously in an equal and fair manner, no matter who you are. It's all part of it. But a large mission, it's one of these things you have to, try to get your arms around the best you can and to prioritize and to try to slowly, change the dialogue and change behavior of people in authority.
I should mention that it's part of a long process, but I was privileged to speak to the cadet class at Michigan State Police. They touted the success of having one trooper in the Ann Arbor Post. That's underrepresentation in MSP, but they're working on it. Also, post Atlanta cases, we've had meetings with the DOJ, the FBI Detroit office, and the U.S. Attorney's Office in Detroit to make sure that they're not as dismissive about hate crimes, not adopting the mentality that Cherokee County, Georgia has. And so that is part of an ongoing process to make sure that they realize that, the AAPI community, deserves consideration,
Right.
within their purview.
That's great. That's great to hear. So we will now be going into a quick moment of resources. I'm sure folks are wondering what is it we can do ourselves in this time to support our AAPI community. And I'm going to bring up OCA's VP of Education and Culture, Emilio Manuel Camu.
Hey everyone, and thank you all for joining us tonight. Some of the stuff that we can do, like Roland and Jim said, is to join your local chapter of OCA or other membership organizations that support and boost the advocacy efforts for Asians and Pacific Islanders. You can also start taking situational awareness training or bystander intervention training. Our very own Advocates in Action situational awareness training has been ongoing. You could also go through Hollaback with Advancing Justice. Some of the other things that you can do is to include Asian American history. If you have the ability and power or the influence to do so, talk to your local state board of education, talk to your districts, include stories like Vincent Chin's and Lily Chin's and the K-12 curriculum. OCA National is working on a expansive K-12 curriculum this year to be able to share to other folks. So keep an eye out for that. For college students or for those who work in colleges and universities, make sure you're supporting ethnic studies by taking Asian American studies classes and learning about Asian American history like this. Other items that you can do is read and learn from Red Canary, from the National Asian Pacific American Women's Fund, and from Advancing Justice, and read some of their statements from the recent incidents for what you can do. Now what we'll do is go in and make sure to link you all of those through the chat, but as well as go into Q&A. I've seen some questions over the chat, and this is for Jim and Roland. There was one that I saw earlier, and this is for either one of you to address from our very own too. What do you think about the narrative, that after these attacks People are saying, you know, it's finally time for the Asian community to come together. It's finally time for us to advocate for ourselves and organize, because we've never we've never seen it before. What do you say to that?
I can address it. There's been activism all along. If people know history, they will know that there have been Asian victims throughout time, whether it's 1871 in Los Angeles with a whole bunch of lynchings, or the internment during World War II, the Vincent Chin case, Fong Lee, who was shot in Minneapolis in, I think it was 2003, Cao Bích Tran, who was shot because she wielded a vegetable peeler. There's just so many cases of actually excessive force by police against Asian Americans, and a comprehensive Asian American studies course would cover all of that. Most of them are well documented.
Thank you, Roland. We have another question here. Was it common for defendants to receive a slap on the wrist treatment for manslaughter at that time in Detroit?
One thing about Detroit in that era, oh, sorry about this.
You go ahead, Jim.
Oh, yep, I need to get plugged back on here. Hold on.
Jim, we can still hear you.
Oh, I know. Well, I'm off right now for some reason. Oh, hang on.
I can step in and just say, at the time, without sentencing guidelines, judges had very, very wide latitude on the upper end and lower end. And there were some judges that were very lenient, and some judges that were, known to be quite harsh. And so there was no, corralling in of or standardization of sentencing. And thanks to the Michigan Organization for Victims Assistance and other groups, the Supreme Court promulgated mandatory minimum sentencing, and then it was legislatively mandated mandatory minimum sentencing. So that is probably an after effect of the case, of the Vincent Chin case.
I have a follow-up question to that. So Judge Kaufman, was he known as a judge that would give a slap on the wrist, or was he one that would actually do otherwise?
He was known as a lenient sentencing judge.
I see.
And Jim, you want to mention his background, his World War II background?
Yeah, he was, I'm afraid my camera's off, guys. I don't.
Oh, we can see you, Jim.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
He had experience in the Pacific Theater during World War II. And we've always suspected in the background, he was really somewhat of a closet racist in his own way. Even though he's Jewish, he would expect something different than that. But his, behavior was pretty appalling, and really, placing a greater value on a white defendants who are alive versus the deceased Asian victim. I mean, that's racism by definition right there. And to his dying day, he was, constantly defending it. I think one of the most really, insulting comments I ever heard was by William Cahalan, the prosecutor. He says, he told me, what are you guys worried about selling deodorant and selling ads on TV? You keep bugging me about this case. And again, totally tone deaf and just ignorant. And that's being kind. I think it's more of a racist than much as anything else. And that's sort of the environment that you face at that time. And not to mention the fact, and this is just reality, in Detroit, they're having almost 1,000 murders a year, 3 a day, pretty much. It was pretty bad at the time. And unfortunately, I think the courts sort of treated murder and homicide as a wholesale business. And in many cases, we're just sort of run through the system. And again, that's something that has to be, noted as well too. You can't treat human life that cheaply and minimize the pain and suffering that families and friends go through when someone gets killed.
Right.
So There's just a lot was going on at the time that contributed to it. But again, you got a system that's very tone deaf. Races at the very core.
Judge Cahalan, in his own defense, he claimed that, well, he had about 2,000 sentences a year. And so I guess that's a claim of being overworked, that he had too many sentences to worry about. But that's out of his own mouth.
I see. So we have another question. People are wondering, how is the Chin family today? Are they still involved in hate crimes? Are they still advocating, collaborating with others? Are they still trying to obtain justice? Do you have any awareness of that?
The sister is still living. Amy is still living, and more distant relatives are still in touch with us. Lily Chin died in 2002. And Vincent's father passed away in 1981. So there's not much Chin family left, but yeah, distant relatives. But they are active. They are following the case.
Wow.
Annie, who's a distant cousin, is active to this day in New York.
Wow. Let's see. I'm just going through some of the questions here. Do we have any recommendations for building alliances, not just among different Asian groups, but with other minorities or people of color? It's always easy to pit one against the other or appearing to encroach on one's turf.
I can address that. American Citizens for Justice is part of a anti-racism, anti-Blackness conversation effort, working in concert with the Arab Center for Economic and Social Services Access, Hispanic Development Corporation, the NAACP Detroit, and Black Family Development to address anti-Blackness and anti-Asian racism. So that coalition building and working collaboratively is continuing to this day.
Right. Yeah, I think it's important to not only be aware of ourselves, but to really have these conversations, because these are biases that we have ingrained in our upbringing, in our education, and just in our family. And sometimes these are just things out of our control. So it's just one of those things about unlearning and relearning, and it's a whole process. But it's good to be patient with yourself, but to make sure that you're actively doing that. So thank you for that question. Another question is, we talked about the importance of national media and ears of important people. Are the racist laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act the root cause to the lack of representation in media and political power? Can you please make a few comments on this?
Well, the Chinese Exclusion Act was really in place for 60 plus years. And what I like to say in my Asian American civil rights class at the University of Michigan is, you wonder when the world is 60% Asian and we're only 6% in the United States. Well, why is that? Well, it's the immigration laws and our legacy of exclusion. Wow. The African American community has a legacy of slavery. The Asian American population really has the legacy of exclusion, and we're still trying to catch up. But that's why we're such small groups. Mm.
Yeah, I think it stems from a very long history of very subtle and ways of affecting us today. So yeah, I think it's always important to look back and see the effects that it creates today. We have a question. What can businesses and corporations do that would be meaningful to help? For those of us who are employees and companies, what are specific steps we can take?
One thing would be to break the glass ceiling. I mean, there's a huge problem in corporate America as far as job opportunities and for promotion, salary-wise. Every survey I've ever seen find that per capita, Asians make less in Fortune 1000 companies. The upward mobility is very, very limited in most cases. And there has to be sort of I would say, confrontation. I know there's been this huge pushback by companies like Coke and others in Delta in Georgia because of the effort to try to suppress votes there with the recent legislation. But there has to be a larger dialogue like that, because I know that, and I've never had, unfortunately, I've never worked, maybe fortunately, depending on you look at it, I've never worked in a Fortune 500 company. I did for a short time as a lawyer, but I think Roland can speak more directly about that. But the hostility many people face within these organizations is awful. And like it or not, the corporations themselves have as much, if not more, influence in the government. You know, this is where economic decisions are made, how the economy is driven, and how people in power can make decisions in the boardroom that can affect millions of people on the stroke of a pen. And that's something that has to be directly attacked in order to try to break that. I noticed there's been a real dearth of APAs on boards of Fortune 500 companies. That's got to change too. And again, pressure to bear. Well, you can speak more about, because you worked at Ford for a long time. You can have some, I'm sure you have some experience you can relate to as far as what goes on.
Well, there's definitely a glass ceiling in terms of management and, presence on board of directors at the auto companies and really corporate America generally. But I did want to address things that are happening just right now. Companies are approaching us to find out what we can do, what they can do. And I mentioned the example of Lyft providing vouchers to get API community members, into Lyft rides to get to their vaccine locations or to go shopping or whatever. That was a very popular program. Thank you, OCA and Lyft, for that. The vouchers were snapped up pretty quickly at the Detroit chapter. But the bank, a local community bank, I mentioned that as a local program, and I think they're entertaining the idea of helping to fund that community by community. I invite all the OCA chapters to invite your community banks, wherever you bank, to maybe fund those buddy walk systems, programs. And that's a way of your chapter getting involved with your local banking institution and let them fund those buddy walk programs that are so much in need right now.
That's great. Yeah, I think it's just being aware of the resources, that we have that communities can, use in times like this. We have another question here. This is actually from Paula Yu, who is publishing a book, who interviewed Jim and Roland for her book, From a Whisper to a Rallying Cry, The Killing of Vincent Chin and the Trial That Galvanized the Asian American Movement. So that's coming out April 2021. So be on the lookout for it. It's for high school students. Jim and Roland, what advice do you have for young teenage activists who are new, who are still learning, who are still finding out their own voice? What are things that you would advise them in times like this?
I think they should write. They should write op-eds. They should document how they feel. Let it be common knowledge that the community is hurting. We as individuals are hurting because of all of this xenophobia. I think that people need to speak out. I mean, we really need to be heard, and it doesn't hurt to spell out how we feel.
I agree.
It's also important, I think, for young adults to take the time to read, learn the history. Unfortunately, the way history is taught, especially in the high schools, is pretty non-existent even now. And something that you really have got, in order to be able to really get your arms on the issue, you have to sort of self-educate yourself as to what history has done and what the current state of affairs are. Things like having an Asian Pacific American student group at your high school, good starting point. Getting involved with the community at large. Trying to seek out other ethnic groups that you may have association with through your school. It's a building process. And, one thing I've said more than once, and it's worth repeating, is the fact that the APA community owes a huge debt of gratitude to the African-American community for being the tip of the spear in the entire civil rights movement. I mean, we've had problems for like the last 3 centuries, but we're also very late to the party when it comes to being organized. And the guidance and the direction that's provided by the Black community is huge for our purposes. And I think it's important that that kind of outreach and coming together to find out there is a thread that goes throughout all these different communities that unites us as far as being targets of racism. It's all part of it. And it starts on small steps. I mean, take time if you're young to talk to other friends, talk to other people with different backgrounds, understand that. And you find out there's a lot more commonality than there is differences. I think one problem is that we get kind of tribal in our approach to things, and that has to change. We have to, to have the courage and the wisdom to reach out and don't stand on our own. It's a tough battle, and we can't do it ourselves. It's going to take a lot of different forces to bear to combat the current environment.
I wanted to address K-12 curriculum. The Southern Poverty Law Center gave Michigan an F in social studies curriculum. And so the DOE, the Department of Education in Michigan, convened a rewrite of the social studies curriculum, and I was named to the civics committee. They had a focus group in the Asian American community to make sure that they had more content, Asian American content, for the K-12 curriculum. And so that's a process that really should be repeated in every state, or at least every state where there's an OCA chapter. Get involved in the education process. It's important for all of your kids, and it really is a process.
Thank you both. Yeah.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Jim.
like just going to your local school board. If you feel like they're not addressing APA history and APA issues, let them know. I mean, they're politicians too. They, if I know almost every school board has so-called public comment period. Roland goes through this all the time too. He's a school board member. He knows what I'm talking about.
Right.
If you keep beating the drum, it does make an impact. They don't have a angry constituency out there like that. But again, it requires confrontation. You can't sit back. I know as APAs, we tend to be sitting on our hands and just watching the scenery go by. We can't do that. You got to take affirmative and proactive steps in order to try to get the ball rolling in our direction. And for all these chapters within OCA, if you have a education committee, I would definitely try to go to as many school boards and say, listen, we want this material as part of the core curriculum. It's in these school districts, and fight from that standpoint. They're not going to do it on their own. There's very, very, very few districts that are going to do this thing voluntarily. You have to confront them. And it starts at the local level. I mean, they always say all politics are local, and this is about as local as it's going to get as far as trying to get the curriculum changed.
Right.
Having lunch a couple of times with the assistant superintendent for curriculum didn't get much mileage. It wasn't until I joined the school board that things started to change.
Yeah.
And so really representation on the school board makes a bit of difference.
Yeah,
You
that's
get to see the
good point.
curriculum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really is a foundational thing. A lot of these topics that I have been learning, I only learned until higher education. I only learned them until I was in college, and I was exposed to these, this way of thinking, of this way of analysis until I entered college. And I think it's so important to be able to have that as a foundation at a younger age and throughout, and that reinforcement in terms of education. So yes, everyone, please do your part, organize. We can be represented in America's story because we are part of America's story. So we're almost coming close. So I'm going to try to end with one more question, and then we can start closing up, unfortunately. Can we talk about the difference between a sentencing for hate crimes rather than a more typical murder charge, or difference to classify a crime as a hate crime? What can we do in telling the differences between these? So is there anything that you can tell us from that legal standpoint?
A crime generally is a crime against a person or property. And then a hate crime is usually a tack-on feature, which would add perhaps $10,000 to the fine or 5 years to the sentence. And so anyway, if the elements are a crime is committed and there's animus, racial animus, or national origin animus, or gender animus, whatever, that would be a tack on, typically, with state litigation. And of course, the feds have their federal civil rights statutes as well, the Matthew Shepard, James Byrd Act, that sort of thing, that are standalone. But it's always a good practice to add on the race crime element if you can develop the evidentiary record.
One of the challenges you have with ethnic based crimes is that it's discretionary by the DA or by the prosecutor, or in the case of going before a grand jury. So even more fundamentally than the statutes themselves, you've got to get law enforcement and the prosecutor and DA's office, aware and willing to add on these additional charges. I mean, it's one thing to say, the guy committed a crime, it's a crime. But whether or not it turns into an ethnic-based crime is really up to the DA, prosecutor, or the grand jury going forward like that. And that's where, again, and being really, not to be crass, but the fact is these are political decisions. These are elected officials, and they do it in response to public pressure and public awareness of the nature of the crimes themselves. So one thing that you could do as chapters around the country is to have these dialogues with law enforcement. If there's any appearance there might be an ethnic crime behind this, prosecute. Don't think twice. Take it before the grand jury. Or if you're charging information, make sure that's one of the counts that's been charged against the defendant. But don't sit there and take it for granted this is going to happen. It doesn't. This is highly discretionary behavior by the people in charge of prosecuting these cases.
Yeah, don't be afraid to approach the prosecutor's office. I think that in part is why 3 county prosecutors, Macomb, Wayne, and Oakland County prosecutors, were at a forum with the Michigan governor and the Michigan Attorney General in words of solidarity for the community, because we've developed sort of that ongoing relationship with those offices. And that's something that should be replicated around the country.
Thank you both. So we are coming to the close. I'm just going to ask if you have any last statement that you wanted to make before we end this great history webinar to start off our series. Jim, you can go ahead.
Well, I think it's encouraging to see the community is kind of rallied around the current environment. But it's the concern I have, and I've mentioned this more than once to other people, it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. We're going through a very, very tumultuous time over the next, say, 15, 20 years or more, as we transition to a majority-minority society. Globalization, trade wars, and looking for scapegoats. This is very typical behavior. And the fact is that no matter what we do, it's going to continue in the background. So it's going to require mass-scale organization, awareness, and really the courage to stand up and fight for what's right. I think we stand back, and again, one thing that Roland I mentioned earlier, if you put the trust in the authorities and law enforcement, you're greatly mistaken. They're human, they have biases, and they have to be held accountable every step of the way. And especially now, I think with social media and groups like QAnon and the 3%ers out running around, it's there. You may not see them. In fact, it's even more dangerous now than ever because they can operate, below the surface without really being seen publicly. And for all of us, people of color, we've got to be aware. We've got to be able to get organized. And it starts with small steps. And I think it's important that if nothing else that comes out of this discussion today, make a commitment, do something, get organized. Even something as simple as just talking to your local police chief, that goes a long, long way to try to avoid a situation that we had in Atlanta. And that, like I said before, it's an ongoing struggle. It's not going to go away in 5 minutes.
Right.
I have a message for all the chapters, and that is measure up your ability to react. And if you've got 5 activists, then you can do a letter writing campaign. If you've got 50 activists, you can have a rally. If you've got just a couple people, you can just make phone calls to the prosecutor's office or the authorities. But it's important to take an inventory of what your capabilities are and then act upon it.
Yes. Thank you both so much. This was definitely a very successful webinar. Roland and Jim, I sincerely thank you for your wisdom and your inspiration, and just thank you for being so active for so long now, and still continuing to do so. The AAPI community owes so much to you and how far we've come in terms of our progress, in terms of our recognition, and just continued work. So we really thank you for being here tonight. Thank you so much. So we'll be closing this off now. I want to thank the audience, whoever has come tonight to take the time to kind of educate yourselves, and also take in something. I hope there's something that you took tonight that you can utilize in your everyday, utilize in the way that you conduct yourselves and how you treat others. So just please keep continuing to learn and going out and putting in the effort to be, a better community, be a better citizen to all of us, to each other and to our community. If you have any questions, be sure to contact me. My email is lady.m.belilan@ocanational.org. I invite all of you, if you're not already, to become an OCA member to your closest chapter. You can do that at ocanational.org. All the information you need is there. If you're all wondering about our future history webinar dates and subjects, those will be coming. If you have any suggestions, feel free to contact me. I forgot to mention this, I'm a history major. So this is why I'm really excited to be doing this, just to be talking about this. I think it's really important that we look back at what's been done and to be ready for what we can do. So once again, thank you so much to Jim Shimura. Thank you so much to Roland Huang. I hope all of you have a great night tonight and take care.